Did any of the following actually happen as described in these scary stories? Leader of the Dog Pack. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I recently saw a segment of your show in which Dogman was associated by a witness with a traveling dog pack. I have a similar story to tell you today. I saw Dogman with around a dozen four-legged assistants as he stalked my own neighbor one night last summer. Let me start at the beginning. I live in Kentucky on a block that only has one other house on it. Both houses are located only about 50 feet apart, although each of them is situated on a much larger property. There is a fairly wild forest that fills up most of the back end of our properties. I say wild because neither of us do anything but allow it to grow. It connects with a legal hunting area, and sometimes hunters venture out onto our property not realizing that they're on private land. For this reason, it can be dangerous back there, at least during hunting season. We have a short stone fence marking the property line that my neighbor George and I built around 23 years ago when he first moved out here to retire. I had inherited both properties from my father, who had bought them from an old farmer when he and Mom got married. One of these had originally been a farmhouse, and the other one was the house that the old farmer's father had built for his son and daughter-in-law to live in. This is why they were situated right next to each other. They had originally both been in the same family. No doubt it was safer to be closer in the olden days when this part of town was still pretty far out in the country. I mean, you could still call it very rural around here, but by the standards of my grandfather's time, we're practically Grand Central Station. There is a commercial block only about a 5-minute walk away that includes a fast food sandwich shop, a convenience and grocery store, and, until recently, a hair salon for women that sadly has not survived the pandemic. Nevertheless, our block is still unpaved, still a dirt path, and so close to the woods, it really still looks like you're out in the very rural countryside. This event I'm going to tell you about is, I hope, a very isolated story. I've never heard about Dogman or Bigfoot being in this area before. In fact, I had zero interest in cryptids until this happened. Now I'm probably more interested in Dogman than I am in the news or the weather. I think about Dogman every day, and I listen to every podcast I can find on the subject at least once. I may not always listen to a second episode, but I give every show at least one try. So I was watching TV in my house, and it was a scary movie. I kept thinking I was hearing shouts, but I assumed they were coming from the TV. Then, I could have sworn I heard someone calling my name, so I lowered the volume and just listened. Sure enough, someone outside was calling for me. I thought it might be my neighbor George, and that sent a bolt of fear shooting through me. He didn't sound normal. He sounded as though something were very wrong. I threw on my slippers and I ran out front, terrified at what I was gonna find. Was he injured? Was he sick? Had he contracted the virus? I didn't know what I was gonna see. Well, when I went out front, I saw something that I never could have guessed would be there. There was my neighbor on the dirt road in front of my house, backing up slowly with a sickeningly frightened expression on his face. I instantly saw what he was afraid of, and I probably adopted the same expression myself. There, beneath me, right in front of my front door, was a pack of wild-looking dogs, and they were surrounding what had to have been some kind of a mutant dog, larger than the others, and even larger than my neighbor George. I inhaled in surprise and found myself choking and coughing, which drew the attention of the dog pack, including that very large one. If you've ever seen a pack of dogs running loose together, it can be a terrifying sight. They are wild and frantic and violent. racing around and jumping and snapping at anything that moves. Not these dogs, though. They were stalking George more like cats might, slowly advancing step by step toward their intended prey, completely silent. When I coughed, those dogs slowly turned their heads in my direction and stared at me. They all had bright white eyes shine like one would expect from a cat. They seemed to almost move in unison with each other. So while they were easily as frightening as any other dog pack, they were also deeply unnerving to witness, as I've never seen dogs that calm before. There was no panting. There were no tongues hanging out of their mouths. They did not bark. They did not whine. A couple of them were actually sitting and lying calmly on the road or on the grass alongside it. And the largest one had a posture more like one of the great apes. It stood observing me in an almost upright position, using one of its long forearms to balance itself, while the other one was held in the air. I was looking at a Dogman that had to be what it was. I don't believe the large one was actually related to the other dogs. However, the smaller ones all had similar markings to each other and must have been an extended family. They were black and brown, but the large one was more of a gray wolf type of shade. They moved and stood still as though they were one creature separated into a dozen or so different canine bodies. I had left a hammer out front when doing repairs not long before that, so I grabbed that hammer and began banging loudly on the metal banister to my front steps. It made a terrible racket, and I saw the expression on the dogs' faces change to one of discomfort. Their ears twitched, and my neighbor George turned and ran back to his house as I banged away. All of the smaller canines got up and trotted away, but that large, gray, shiny-eyed Dogman just stood there, staring at me, looking as though he wanted me to stare back at him. I felt as though it wanted me to look into its eye shine. I felt like it was trying to hypnotize me. A normal wild animal gets angry when you meet its eyes, but this most unnatural creature actually craved my eye contact. When I heard George slam his door and I knew he was safely inside, I retreated back into my own house. I called the police, telling them a pack of wild dogs was roaming around. Out here, the police will respond to you for calls like that. We all know one another, and they know I wouldn't waste their time with imaginary stories. Then, I called George, and he told me his side of things. He had been walking home from the store just after dusk, and the pack of dogs was alongside the road, watching him calmly. As he passed them, they quietly sauntered into the dirt road and began matching him, step for step. Then, when he got in front of my house, he called for me and I knew the rest of the story. The dogs were gone by the time the police showed up, but they took statements from both me and George. They said they'd drive around looking for the pack, but as far as I know, they never found any of them. It'll be a year this July since it happened, but we haven't seen them again so far. I admit, both George and I are getting tense about the idea of them coming back this summer, and we've even discussed the possibility of going somewhere else to live until autumn. He and I no longer feel safe during the hot months on our own property, since we had our face-to-face meeting with the leader of the dog pack. Don't go anywhere, we've got another Dogman story, or is it a werewolf story, still to come. But first, I'd like to give a shout out to this episode's executive producer, Nicola Scammell. What can you say about our EP Scammell? More strength and style than the hardest enamel. We like Ms. S, a real rock and roller, whether pronouncing it Nicola or Nicola. Please join me in thanking Nicola Scammell for making this episode possible. In return, we send her links to see our secret uncensored Dogman stories far too wild to run on this channel. Not only that, but also our 15 hours of archived, uncensored Dogman stories as well. We'd love to share all of this with you too. All you have to do is join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com or click the join link under this or any of our videos and become a channel member. And now, onto our second Dogman story of the day, which is entitled The Werewolf That Was a Dogman, or The Dogman and the Wise Man. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a story for you that my grandfather told me when I was younger. I was watching a werewolf movie on TV. I don't even remember which one, when my grandpa started interrupting and saying that werewolves weren't real. It was the kind of thing he did, interrupt and tell old stories that nobody asked him to tell. I said to him, I knew already that werewolves weren't real. It was a movie, not a documentary. But then he clarified that he was saying that werewolves aren't people who shapeshift, as in the movies. According to him, werewolves were a kind of predatory animal, halfway between human and canine. That was something I had never heard before. I asked him to please explain in greater detail, since I was trying to figure out if he was telling me something real, or if he was just going senile. His story made sense all right, but I still wasn't sure what to make of it. He told the story in a straightforward manner, just like he told me about how he would get paid to vote as dead people by his mafia friends. The mob will never allow voter ID to happen was one of his catchphrases we would imitate him saying, because then anyone could get elected instead of the candidate that they needed to get in there. It seemed funny to us as kids, but I was more interested in monsters than elections, so this one stuck in the back of my mind for the rest of my life. I'll tell it to you as well as I can remember it, and you tell me what you think. Okay, I'm not sure when this took place, but my grandfather was still young. I don't know if he was kid young or teenager young or maybe in his 20s, but in any case, it had to have been in the first half of the 20th century. He and his family lived in the same farmhouse even for a few years after he had gotten married. I don't think Grandma and Grandpa got their own house until they were in their 30s, if I remember the family story correctly. Back then, most of the town were of Middle to Eastern European descent, but there was one rich man at the edge of town from the east somewhere. I don't know which country he originated from or if he might have been first-generation American, but he was of some kind of an Asian descent. He interacted very little with the rest of the town, and so people made up their little suspicious stories about that fellow. A rash of animal disappearances plagued the village one summer, and of course, the outsider, as he was often referred to, was suspected of the crimes. I'm talking both household pets disappearing as well as farm animals. Families were very dependent on their animals for their livelihood in those days, so it wasn't just an emotional pain, but it was a financial burden that they were not equipped to handle. With so much stress added to their lives, they lashed out in anger. Stories began to circulate that the outsider was a witch of some sort, practicing an evil brand of Eastern magic, of which no Occidental man would have any knowledge or awareness. Obviously now, looking back on it, we can say that they were watching too many movies, and they were being very superstitious. But back then, these seemed to them like real things to be very afraid about. Then came the first sighting of what was called the werewolf, and the consensus hardened that it had to be that outsider witch transforming into a monster and stealing their livestock and pets. I paused Grandpa and asked him to explain in more detail about this supposed werewolf sighting. I had never heard of such a thing. I had no idea that anyone had ever tried to assert that werewolves existed outside of movies and books. Grandpa told me to go get his pipe and his tobacco, and he tried to remember the details for me. I remember him staring upwards, smoking, and remembering for a while before he began. The first report of the werewolf came from our neighbor Zach, he started. Zach was out checking on his cattle. He counted the entire herd, and everyone was accounted for. On his way back, however, he noticed the herd bunching together in one spot, acting strange. And there was a calf missing. From one side or another, he heard that calf bleeding in distress, and when he turned to look, he saw the largest man he had ever seen, carrying the calf away under his arm, just as though he were carrying his personal property. I remember asking if the outsider was a tall man, and Grandpa laughed. No, the outsider was not even as tall as the other locals, he went on. But it didn't matter anyway, because when Zach ran after the fellow and got a bit closer, he saw that was not a human being at all. Grandpa then went on to describe the creature turning around and hissing at his neighbor Zach. Like a snake, I asked, but Grandpa said, no, more like a big cat. Except this was not a big cat. This was a big canine. Like a wolf, but also not like a wolf. In what ways was he like or unlike a wolf? I was confused by this narrative. Grandpa said, well, it looked like a big gray wolf, except it stood up straight and tall on its hind legs like a man. Its head looked more like a dog or a wolf than a man's head, but it wasn't exactly like a wolf either. It was some kind of other sort of beast. Zach was so terrified that even though he was armed, he backed off and let the creature take his prized calf away. Grandpa explained that would sort of be like backing off and letting someone take your car, because that's how valuable a calf would have been to that farmer, maybe even more so. But still, his fear was so complete that he made no effort to get that young cow back. Needless to say, the story spread like wildfire throughout the area. Nobody had an explanation except for those who blamed the outsider. A group of men, including the sheriff and the pastor, walked on over to the man's house and knocked on his door. He came out to greet them, and the townsfolk confronted him with their situation. Our livestock and pets have been disappearing lately, they told him. The old man from the east answered them simply by asking, is that so? One of us has seen a tall, wolf-like creature taking away a calf, as though he were carrying away his lunch, the sheriff announced. Is that so? Asked the outsider. Yes, and he was seen walking in the direction of this house, the pastor told the man. Is that so? Came the reply. Each time he answered the same way, and each time the townsmen became more agitated. Some began to openly threaten the man until the pastor and sheriff sent them home to try to de-escalate the situation. Once the two were alone with the Easterner, they warned him that they wouldn't be able to keep the crowd calm much longer. These men were subsisting as it was. They could not afford to lose any more of their animals. If this Easterner were responsible somehow, or if he knew who or what was at fault, they reminded him it was his responsibility to come clean about it. Is that so? Came the reply. Frustrated by the deep calm exhibited by their enigmatic neighbor, the two authority figures retreated. They both felt as though the old man was not appreciating the importance of this situation. They even wondered if he had understood what they had been saying. Well, the older folk in town stood up to defend the Easterner. They insisted that every 7 years, this same thing had happened to the town going back decades, long before that man had moved to their area. They said it was a curse, a beast who came around taking what it wanted for a summer, then leaving and cursing other places for 6 years before returning. Nobody listened to them because that wasn't what they wanted to hear. They were angry and they wanted to do something to satisfy their fury. They called the older people crazy and senile, and they led a lynch mob over to the outsider's house one dark night. Just like in the movies when the mob would show up with pitchforks and torches, the townsfolk gathered outside the old man's house and shouted for him to come out. When he did, they screamed at him that they knew he was a witch and a sorcerer. Is that so? He asked calmly. The crowd continued, saying they knew he used his evil wizardry to transform into a satanic devil beast, half man and half dog-like cur. Is that so? He responded, seeming to be politely listening to their account of events, still remaining completely undisturbed by the proceedings. Shouts erupted from the rear of the crowd as someone's farmhand ran to the front. He was screaming in terror that the werewolf was back and that he had one of the farmers' wives cornered on their property. The sheriff demanded the outsider come with them as they all ran over to the location that the farmhand led them to. Sure enough, when they reached the place, there was an 8 or 9 foot tall, impossible-looking hairy monster, and it had a woman backed up into a corner of her own family's barn. On that night, almost all of the men of the town got to see the monster for the first time. It had ears up on top of its hairy cranium, and it looked just like a wolf, but it also looked like some sort of savage prehistoric human at the same time. It did not wear clothing. It seemed more of a wild animal than a sorcerer who had transformed into a werewolf. The pastor began praying aloud, almost as though this were an exorcism. The town was Protestant, though. They did not actually believe in exorcisms, but the pastor did what he knew best. The sheriff also reacted according to the dictates of his social position, and he began warning the beast to back off. There was an assumption that it would understand their words, and that it was at least partially human. The beast did not speak back, however. It bared its teeth and began growling at the crowd, making itself large and posturing in a threatening manner. The trapped farmer's wife was able to run out of the position she had been backed into, and her husband removed her from the danger. It was then that the remaining crowd charged the beast with their torches and pitchforks, and that dog-headed man surprised everyone by scaling the sheer wall of the barn, exiting through the window far above them all. It must have had claws long and sharp enough to grab through the wooden barn wall because the speed it flew upward was perceived as truly shocking by the mob of angry men. Rather than chase after it, they fell to their knees, feeling as though they had been in the presence of a truly great evil. The pastor continued to pray loudly, asking the Lord for protection, and even the sheriff was on his knees, shaken and humbled by the terrifying sight of the Dogman. All of them were on their knees praying, all that is, except the outsider from the east, who stood patiently, observing the behavior of the others. When the crowd began to disperse, the sheriff approached the outsider and offered a deep and sincere apology to him. They had all seen the monster with their own eyes, and he, the outsider, had been proven innocent. "Is that so?" came the reply from the gentleman, still taking things in stride. The sheriff admitted that the man had been wronged. He had almost been lynched, and the townsfolk owed him something as an apology. The sheriff and the pastor both insisted that the Easterner must be compensated in some way, and that it would be wrong if he were not. "Is that so?" came the stranger's reply, and all the sheriff and pastor could do was laugh. In one sense at least, that man truly was a wizard. Well, the animal disappearances continued through the rest of that summer, but nobody suspected the outsider any longer. In fact, they stopped calling him the outsider and they called him by his real name. He got personally invited and welcomed to the town's events for the remainder of the time that there even was a town. You see, before another 7 years had passed, a major highway was built by the government, cutting directly through several of the farms. The feds acquired the land via eminent domain laws, and half the town or more relocated. Those who remained gave up farming and either built or worked in the new stores located along the interstate. Nothing was the way it had been before, ever again. If the Dogman did indeed come back 7 years later, there were not enough farms or livestock left for anyone to even notice its presence. Grandpa felt that the beast most likely found a different area to migrate through, or perhaps it starved due to lack of game to steal. Nobody around where I grew up ever talked about werewolves or dogmen any longer. And this was all because of the Dogman and the Wise Man.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. You have a scary experience you want to tell us about? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.